Hello, welcome to the Revolution Diaries podcast series with my co-anchors Richard George and Abhi Solanki. My name is Shreyas Galugula, and today we're going to discuss the battles of New York and the Siege of Boston. These battles are significant in their own right, but we'll get into why later. We'll also talk about this mystery fellow here, events that led up to these battles, and after that we have a special treat for you guys.
Thanks so much, Shreyas, for that well-versed intro to our podcast. Today's episode covers the Siege of Boston and the Battle of New York, as we mentioned earlier. Before we get into the juicy details of these two significant battles during the American Revolution, we must review the events we have covered in previous episodes, as we have always done. Abhi, here's the mic.
Thanks, by the way, Richard. Following the Intolerable Act used to punish and discipline Boston for its organization destruction of the British East India Company tea in the Boston Tea Party, General Thomas Gage was chosen by the British monarch King George III to lead the British fight against the uprising colonists.
Anyway, Gage learned that gunpowder and weapons were in Concord Village through some British spies, but they had to strike before it was used by the Patriots. Therefore, on April 18, 1775, 600 to 700 British soldiers left at night to seize weapons, but the colonists also had their own spies, Paul Revere and William Dawes, who were informed by Patriots. Due to this form of espionage, the ammunition and weapons hoped to be found were relocated before the British arrived. That night, they commenced a midnight ride when they informed the militiamen of the British movements. Dawes was definitely influential, but Revere really took the spotlight.
This was when you can think back to, oh, the British are coming, the British are coming. When you think back to that, you really only think of Paul Revere. You never really think of William Dawes.
Not really Dawes.
Exactly. So next we'll talk about the militia people that were actually fighting. So a city called Lexington was on the road to Concord, where many of the militiamen were standing together and prepared to fire before they got fired at by the British. But somehow, when the two armies met each other, a shot was fired, and that was one of the first shots in the Revolutionary War.
Later, there was the standoff at the Concord Bridge, where they sent volleys of shots at each other, which was soon to become the shot heard around the world. Should be shots, not shot. Trust me, I had a lot of them.
Anyway, let's move on.
Then, the colonists opened fire at the British as they retreated through the woods and eventually Charlestown necked. Even though the battle killed 73 British regulars and 49 militia, it showed that the colonists could fight back against the British and proved that they could stand up to one of the most powerful armies in the world.
Yeah, guys, you should have been there.
Anyway, thanks, Abhi, for the introduction, but thanks, Shreyas, for that a little too excellent summary on the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Shreyas, please take it away with a discussion on the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Wait. Before you talk about it, please mention the creation of the Continental Army.
So on June 10th, 1775, John Adams proposed the creation of the Continental Army, made of the militia surrounding Boston. The believed military effort of the army would only succeed if the British thought that the colonies were united, which, hopefully, they could be. Many delegates in the Second Continental Congress mentioned that George Washington would be a great candidate to lead it, and he does accept on June 15, 1775, after they elect him unanimously as commander-in-chief. Although it was a unanimous vote, some opposed him, believing that others were more qualified, but he was chosen as he could join the South for the cause. So, while George Washington eventually assumed the eternal position as head of the Continental Army, the Battle of Bunker Hill occurred on June 17, 1775, right outside Boston on Breed's Hill. But since Breed's Hill was extremely close to Bunker Hill, the battle's name became a misnomer. For more than 2 centuries, historians just decided to keep it that way. I'm disappointed. To continue, the Battle of Bunker Hill was during the Siege of Boston, but it was the deadliest battle for the British during the war, during the entire Revolutionary War.
Militiamen under Colonel William Prescott dug themselves up and fortified Breed's Hill on June 16th, and the new British commander-in-chief, William Howe, attacked the Americans at Breed's Hill with 2,000 men strong, who were pushed back 2 times. The British suffered over 1,000 casualties, but they technically won as they took the hill.
The Americans suffered over 400 casualties who ran out of ammunition during the battle. The British began to become nervous from the Battle of Bunker Hill onward and realized that they were in a full-scale battle with the Patriots. It truly was a moral and confidence victory for the Patriots.
Thanks, Abhi, for that concise conclusion on the Battle of Bunker Hill and a review of the creation of the Continental Army with Shreyas that holds on throughout the Revolution.
I wish I could have been there.
Well, I mean, I guess, but you couldn't have been there, right? These took place hundreds of years ago during our country's founding.
But,
Abby, no time for introductions. Our viewers are waiting, of course.
okay, Richard, whatever.
Anyway, it's time for us to describe to our podcaster members that the events of the Siege of Boston and the momentous Battle of New York. Throughout these impactful engagements throughout Massachusetts and New York, these important figures were present: George Washington, Nathanael Greene, Israel Putnam, Henry Knox, Thomas Gage, and William Howe. On the American side, we have George Washington from 1732 to 1799, who was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and later our first president.
There were also many other important generals. One such general was Nathanael Greene from 1742 to 1786. He was one of the most skilled and celebrated generals and proved to be an able commander at the Siege of Boston and the Battle of Trenton and Princeton. In 1778, he was the quartermaster general, and after the Battle of Brandywine and Germantown in the Pennsylvania campaign, he was promoted to the Southern commander. In that capacity, he turned the tide of the war for the Patriots in the South, and his division of troops led to monumental victories at Kings Mountain and Cowpens. Throughout the Southern campaign, he isolated the British at the coast and forced them out of the South. Truly a monumental time for him. Another important general during the Siege of Boston was Major General and Chief of Artillery Henry Knox from 1750 to 1806. He enlisted and befriended General George Washington and was initially commissioned as the colonel of the Continental Regiment of Artillery. As the war passed, he rose his rank to Major General and Chief of Artillery for the war and was always with Washington during the major battles, always helping him out. Finally, on the American side was Major General Israel Putnam from 1718 to 1790, and he was a paramount during the American movement of the Battle of New York. He served in the French and Indian War as a seasoned officer and used to be a farmer and a tavern keeper. As the Revolutionary War ensued, Putnam offered his services to the army after Lexington conquered, and his leadership highly influenced the Battle of Bunker Hill when he commanded the New England forces in Massachusetts. His performance at Bunker Hill, though, was the climax of his military career. From then on, he just lost many skirmishes in battle and was forced to resign after he suffered a terrible stroke. Anyway, that's it for the Americans. Let's go on to the British. Richard?
General Thomas Gage from 1720 to 1787 was the commander-in-chief of the North American British forces after the French and Indian War. But after taking the position, he was a lieutenant general. In 1774, he was appointed Royal Governor of Massachusetts to destroy unrest and rebellion. In that position, though, Gage actually increased tensions between Britain and her colonies by enforcing Parliament's laws and asking for even harsher punishments from Parliament itself. He eventually ordered the events on Lexington Concord, which caused the Revolutionary War.
General William Howe, 1729 to 1814, was once the replacement for General Thomas Gage's head position after the loss at Bunker Hill, and a major general prior during the service in the French and Indian War. Now let's get into the real stuff.
So, the Siege of Boston was a very important time for the Patriots. It all started when the Continental Congress voted on creating the Continental Army, led by George Washington, way back in April 1775.
I knew him. He was a really good guy.
Sure. Anyway, a guy named Artemus Ward was tasked with getting the Continental Army, the Massachusetts militia, in shape and ready to fight for the freedom before Washington's arrival. However, Ward was bad at his job, and the army ended up in worse condition than when they started.
Yeah, that's why Washington put Nathanael Greene and Henry Knox in charge of helping command the army with his authoritative power. He was shocked at the state of the army and tried to instill discipline and organization. 15,000 ruffian militia laughing and roughing it out. Washington hated that. Washington was prepared for a full-on attack on Boston, but Greene and Knox proposed otherwise. They instead prepared for a siege.
The siege was going to be massive. Henry Knox and a group of men were sent to Fort Ticonderoga to receive the cannons and the mortars needed. The fort was captured previously by Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys, and used to be an old British fort from the French and Indian War.
Right. So the troops moved from the Boston area all the way to northern New York to receive the supplies, and later came back in January 1775. Estimates say that they got around 64 tons of cannons and mortars, along with 2,300 pounds of lead. Now, you might be wondering how they managed to transport all this weaponry, but the answer is really simple. Oxen. And sleds.
Yeah.
It's time we talk about geography and weather during the Ticonderoga expedition. It was a cold winter, and Colonel Henry Knox believed that his trip was impossible, and it was also very mountainous and hilly, which proved to be a blessing and a curse. They made it even harder for Knox to travel through the harsh winter, but gave Washington a good strategic advantage to set up a siege, overlooking the city of Boston and the ships in Boston Harbor.
Meanwhile, in Boston, life is awful. Soldiers were hungry, people were dying, and nobody was having a good time because they were forced to control the city for months. Sadly, the British couldn't do anything. They had to stay and needed to be ready to fight on a moment's notice. General Thomas Gage controlled Boston with 6,500 British regulars, but he lost his position after the Bunker Hill losses.
While they were suffering, everyone in the Continental Army prepared for a siege. Cannons and mortars were set all around Boston, specifically at Dorchester Heights, on the night of March 4th.
Dorchester Heights, that's right over here, which means that they have to have gotten the stuff from Fort Ticonderoga. It's also going to be up there somewhere. Brought it down, set it up on this hill, but more importantly, they set it up on Dorchester Heights, which, as you can see, overlooks the city of Boston. Anyway, let's go into the mind of a British soldier. He were chased back to Boston since the events of Lexington and Concord, and there was no reasonable way of escape aside from fleeing the city. You could attack, but a storm has pushed your opportunity window back. Neither options are desirable, and nobody wants to do anything. You're hungry, you're sad, but most importantly, you're scared of what the Patriots might manage to do next. Finally, on the night of March 4th, you see the cannons set up on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city, pointed straight at you. This was the last straw. You, the army with 9,000 British soldiers and the other 1,100 or so loyalists, fled the city all the way to Nova Scotia, Canada, with 0 casualties, including the new general, William Howe.
The casualties were as follows. 469 Americans died or were wounded to 1,160 British soldiers during Bunker Hill and the skirmishes surrounding it. 30 Americans were captured to 35 throughout all the skirmishes, but not the siege. Once more, the Battle of Bunker Hill took place during the siege of Boston.
This was a resounding moral and tactical victory for the Patriots and set out a message that they were actually going to win the war. With the empowered Continental Army, a major turning point.
The Americans capture the city and keep Boston for the rest of the war, which ends the 8-year occupation of Boston.
Thank God. The focus of the war away from the New England colonies and proved that the Continental Army could stand up against the British in the battlefield and had the strength to fight it.
However, what happens next is a struggle, the near end of the war.
Well, it was a tragic time when the Continental Army lost the Battle of New York.
Yeah, it was. I mean, if the Americans just planned a little bit better, they probably could have won.
There was a huge difference in the casualties between the British and the Americans.
Yeah, it was 1,047 casualties to the Americans, 300 dead, 650 wounded, and 1,100 captured, compared to the 377 casualties, and 314 wounded, and only 63 dead.
So, the time George Washington read the Declaration of Independence to his troops, it was evidence that it would give good morale to...
Everyone would have believed that they would win the battle.
But somehow, they lost and surrendered.
Also, Washington and the army ran away with soldiers.
It was like he was going to live to fight for another day, but he didn't.
Well, I guess we need to talk about what exactly happened.
I guess we should.
Yeah, so anyway, it all started when William Howe sent his fleet to occupy New York, where he finds Washington. Howe asks for a peaceful surrender. Washington says no.
Why did William Howe decide to move to New York City?
Howe went to occupy New York City since it was a major trading post and he wanted to make it the head of the British operations.
Sounds like Washington was really brave.
Trust me, he was.
Washington soon moved his army down to New York City to defend from a British invasion. At Brooklyn Heights, southwest of Long Island, Greene was set up ready to fight in fortifications on Brooklyn Heights across from the East River. However, Greene soon fell ill and was replaced by Israel Putnam. Sadly, Putnam was generally worse than Greene. Howe, meanwhile, was stationed at Long Island and wanted to trap the Americans by a warship blockade.
George Washington protected his left flank by putting a third of his troops on the Long Island side of the East River with force. He also created 3 divisions on southern Manhattan and one Fort Washington with 6,500 men protecting the main American columns. The rest blocked the British from heading to the roads.
After that, the British were stationed with 20,000 troops with 9,000 Hessians inside in Staten Island and wanted to attack on land and trap the Americans with another warship blockade, like in Boston. August 22nd, 30,000 regulars and Hessian mercenaries attacked from the beaches. Howe created 3 assault columns. Even though there were downpours, Howe's left and center marched forward to attack towards the American rear, and Putnam changed his position to counterattack.
The Americans tried to salvage their troops, but it was pointless. The Americans were outflanked and defeated. The British struck, and boy did they hit hard. Eventually, after a massive attack, Howe slow-played the movement of his army for 2 days in front of the American forts to make a grand assault. He did not want to sacrifice as many soldiers like he did in Bunker Hill, so he learned his lesson.
At this point, Washington had to retreat, but lucky for him, the fog was able to mask the retreats. After retreating, Putnam's decreasing forces in Brooklyn Heights and leaving the Maryland 400 to die while defending them. They escaped to Manhattan Island. They were betrayed fight after fight, notably at Kings Bay and Harlem Heights. They were chased back to New Jersey and then to Pennsylvania.
Wait a minute, how did geography play a role in all of this?
The abundance of rivers and lakes forced the Americans to build large redoubts and entrenchments along Brooklyn Heights. Hulks were used to prevent British ships from entering the East River, while Fort Washington and Fort Lee were established to prevent passage of the Hudson. The Continental Army knew that they had the disadvantage without the ships Howe had. Though the British were advantageous, it was rainy and foggy that made this harder to see. The end was terrible. It was a decisive British victory and the first major battle since the Declaration of Independence. The isolation of New England from the rest of the colonies by conquering New York was imminent.
The battle showed the war would be super hard and many soldiers would die over the entire of the revolution. From then on, the Continental Army began to change their strategy by implementing more guerrilla-style fighting that they were good at. Well, in the end, the battle was pretty awful, but now we'll have a special treat for you. We'll get to go back in time and visit George Washington right after this terrible loss. We'll see you then. Alright. Wait, I think that's George Washington.
When I found you men, I was shocked. You guys looked tired, annoyed, and unfit to fight. I needed someone to help you guys turn from men to soldiers. I was there when I saw the first birth of confidence in you. You guys were there when we chased out the British out of Boston. You guys are great. We shouldn't let a simple loss set you back. There should be no reason. We were cheated and tricked out of New York. But it's okay. We will gain the city back and we will prevail. We just got a list in Philadelphia that said we are officially free. We are the United States, and everyone is counting on us. Now I shall read what Thomas Jefferson wrote about us. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect
Wow, this is a long speech.
Requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. From the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, Mr. Washington, Mr. Washington, Mr. Washington, Mr. Washington, Mr. Washington. Hi. So, can you just take a few minutes of your time to answer some questions, you know?
Sure, anything for my men.
I don't look like one of your men. Why would you think that?
Oh, true. Yeah, with your questions, right?
Yeah. So, first, what were your first impressions about seeing the Continental Army under Artemus Ward? Like, what did you feel?
I was pretty shocked at the state of the army. I thought Artemis Ward would do a much better than I was even thinking about. But, you know, they looked pretty horrible. They didn't have much guns.
That's harsh. Do you think being a little slow play with that kind Alright, whatever. Anyway, next question. Why did you pick Nathaniel Green and Henry Knox to be your second in command?
I did pick Nathaniel Green and Henry Knox to be my second in command because Henry Knox would provide artillery from Fort Ticonderoga, which the Green Mountain Boys conquered, and also Nathaniel Green would be great for the new army that we would be producing.
Great. So then, what did you do after you got the supplies from Ticonderoga?
We took the supplies from Fort Ticonderoga. We set up the artillery and cannon along Dorchester Heights and focused it around Boston and shot several shots at the British ships in Boston Harbor.
So wait, why did you pick Dorchester Heights?
I picked Dorchester Heights because it provided a high elevation from the British fortifications in Boston Harbor, and it would be good for sniping the British.
So then, while planning the attack, would you think that this was going to work?
We believe that the attack would work because the British were pretty skeptical about our patriot cause, and we believe that our cannons would be suitable for the entire British army there.
Right. So let's go into what just happened in New York.
Oh yes, the scandal of New York.
So why do you believe you lost in New York?
I believe we lost because it was just bad poor planning, the bad weather, the geography that really limited our movements.
So how so? Explain.
We see how he made like a columnar movement into our army. He made like a complete diversion that was surprising in the night.
Talking about this diversion, do you think that'd be your own incompetence for not knowing about this would have led to your downfall in New York?
Usually 18th century, European fighting battles would occur on an open field, so even our position was kind of scandalous.
Right. So, I'm sorry for the loss, dude. It was crazy.
Wait, what is dude?
Yeah, I don't really know how to describe it.
Like it's dirt? Like the dirt? Or like
whatever. Anyway, thanks for your time, Mr. Washington. Alright.
Hey, thanks for watching the podcast. We hope you enjoyed it.
Tune in next time for the next episode of Revolution Diaries.
Hope you have a great day.
Bye.